is a review of the Banksville Planning and Zoning Study. And Joanne is going to present that again. Getting you busy?
You are. Okay. Well, we began to talk to the town board, or representatives of the town board, several months ago about this study. You probably know that Banksville has been receiving a lot of attention over a very long period of time. A good deal of the town development plan that was adopted in 1996 is devoted to the discussion of this area. And then when the town board several years later undertook a planning and zoning study under a moratorium, a good deal of attention was focused on trying to implement the plan, the policies of the town development plan. That environmental review process involved the preparation of a draft generic environmental impact statement as well as a final generic environmental impact statement. And at the end of that process, the town board decided not to proceed with all of the recommendations of the town development plan. Originally, there had been 5 areas of proposed rezoning in the Banksville area, and our report indicates that the town board had proceeded with 2 of them. In fact, based on my more recent discussions with Adam, we were only able to find evidence of one of those local laws having been adopted, so we'll make that correction in this memo. The property at the northeast corner of Banksville Road and Banksville Avenue ultimately was not rezoned into the CBD district, so it does remain in the GB district as the town zoning act presently shows.
That's inches.
That's right.
Inches, so.
Exactly. So what we were asked to do was to sort of take stock of existing conditions in terms of land use conditions and environmental conditions as a launching off point. We were also asked to sort of bring everybody up to date on the past history of all the different studies that have been done in the Banksville area and what the policy recommendations were and what came out of that process. And then to sort of look forward and try to identify possible strategies that the town board might want to further study for zoning policies along the north side of Banksville Avenue. The study area has changed over the years. Obviously, the town development plan looked at the entire Banksville Hamlet, and then the GEIS process that the board was engaged in for a number of years, again looked at the entire Hamlet, focusing on 5 specific areas of rezoning. 3 of those 5 areas involve proposed changes from the GB district, the general business district, to the central business Banksville district, the CBD district. And of those 3, only one of them ultimately was adopted, and that was the rezoning of the former gas station across the street from the firehouse on the northern part of Banksville Road. The other 2 were not adopted. One was on the west side of Banksville Road, behind the tennis court facility, and the other was Finch's. And then the other 2 areas of rezoning that had been proposed, which were involving much larger areas of land, were proposals to change the GB district zoning to residential zoning. In one case, 2 acre, in the other case, 1 acre. And the north side of Banksville Avenue was the area that had been recommended for R1A zoning. And again, that was not adopted. So in about 2009, the town board began to look at this again and had asked our office to come up with a work program to re-examine everything that had not been addressed as part of the implementation phase in 2005 and 2006. And at that point, it was determined that the scope of that study was going to be too broad, and the town wasn't prepared to fund that particular study, and so it was just put aside temporarily. And then last summer, we were again asked to look at this, but the town was probably going to look at it in a more phased manner, and priority attention was going to be given to the north side of Banksville Avenue, and that's the subject of the study we received recently. The existing land use map we included in our report. I understand there may be one discrepancy that has been suggested to be clarified and correct. This was based upon visual inspection, basically driving through the street, recording what we thought the existing land use was. You can see from this map that there's quite a variety of land uses going on that particular street. Everything from a vacant piece of property to or a vacant land to a vacant building on a developed piece of property. It includes some single-family uses, a 2-family use, several contractor storage yards, automotive use, so sort of a lawn supply equipment business, and then sort of a retail food establishment at the western end where Finch's is. So as the town development plan observed back in 1996, there's great variety of uses on that street. And generally that has remained. The study area also includes a couple of lots that have frontage on Roundhouse Road, and one of those, as you recall, was the subject of a proposed contractor storage yard a few years ago. And several of the neighbors then together purchased that property, and that particular application obviously ceased. Since that time, that house has been put under construction for a single-family residence. That's noted on the land use map. So that's really been the only change of note that's occurred in the past several years. We know that there's another application under review now for a contractor storage yard in one of the other properties on Banksville Avenue. The correction that was brought to my attention on this figure 2 in the report that we supplied to you was a property that we had coded as a single-family residence, because that's exactly what it looked like as you drive by the property, but there's a garage and a contractor storage operation behind that residence. So we will make that correction on the land use map. Just to
So
the
that
west
one
of the
is
two
coded
counties.
as what?
It really, I don't know, the single-family residence still appears to be residential. It looks like it's in 2 uses. Maybe the owner is renting out the house or lives there, I'm not sure, but the front is residential.
No, it should be purple.
The
What
front
I
is-
suggest is just make a dotted line here, and leave that yellow, and then this color goes here.
Oh, okay, so it should be purple.
So that's the correction we make. You probably realize that a good deal of the town development plan focused on environmental characteristics of the town. Much more attention was given to that in the 1996 plan update than in any of the prior plans the town had adopted. And so that's also an important factor for the study of the Banksville area. The topography is somewhat variable, although it doesn't have extreme slopes for the most part. The big areas, little small areas have some, but not most. There are some large areas that have been identified as hydric soils at the western and the eastern ends of the study area. They sometimes correspond to wetlands, although there are no state wetlands that have been identified here. Locally, there are some site-specific areas that might qualify as wetlands. You can see just by driving down the street that the characteristics of the property are largely dependent on how the land has been used. Properties that are in residential use or have not been fully developed still show wooded areas and large green spaces, and properties that have been developed almost show no evidence of what the existing condition may have been at one time. Probably the most important feature of this area is the one that you can't see when you're driving down the street, and that is the presence of an aquifer under at least the western half, or something resembling the western half of the whole study area. Many years ago, I think it was around 1990, Westchester County designated several critical environmental areas county-wide, and also several in North Castle. One of them was actually designated over the aquifer that runs through Banksville. There's a number of different maps that show that area. The boundary is not identical in all of those maps. We've checked with different sources. There's a map that was part of the 1996 plan that shows more or less the western half of the study area being encompassed within that sensitive area. Another map was prepared by the town engineer's office during the 2005-2006 environmental review process. That map shows the area being slightly more constricted, so that the boundary of it is a little bit west of what the town plan map shows. And then there's the county's own map, which shows an area that's very much similar to what the 1996 plan showed, which basically would encompass about half of the western half of the study area along the Banksville Avenue area. So what that really means is that some heightened level of scrutiny should be given to any proposals that are on property that happen to be located within that area. As part of the 2005-2006 environmental review process, there were quite a number of different recommendations that the town board was considering in order to implement town plan policies. Another one of those proposals was to create a groundwater protection overlay district, and that was intended to be superimposed upon any aquifer of 10 acres or greater throughout the town. And if a property was located in that proposed overlay district, there were a number of restrictions and additional responsibilities that would have to be pursued. There were land use restrictions. Certain types of land uses would not be permitted at all. And then if a proposal was submitted for approval, the applicant would need to supply additional technical data, hydrogeological analysis, and other technical information for review by the board. That was another of the proposed town plan implementation recommendations that ultimately was not pursued by the town board. That was also tabled. The town board did receive a lot of comment on it, although I think there were many comments supporting the concept of having special legislation to protect the aquifers. There was a lot of concern about the specifics of the legislation. There was a feeling that it went farther than it needed to go, that perhaps it wasn't totally grounded in science in all respects, and that there was certain burdens that were going to be placed upon property owners that exceeded the benefits that were thought to be achieved by that legislation. So I don't know that the town board abandoned it forever, and it might be something to examine again, but at that point in time, in the form in which it was presented, it was not adopted. But it's still obviously an important issue that probably will govern the board's thinking about Banksville and what should be done about zoning in that area. Okay, I'd like to talk a little bit about the zoning. That was another part of the study. The study area by definition included just the north side of Banksville Avenue, and that's entirely in the GB district at the present time, including that property at the westernmost end, which we weren't certain about originally. We noticed that one of the, we decided to present the zoning in a way that we thought would be most helpful to the board. So rather than presenting it in sort of a conventional manner, which is the way it appears in the town zoning law itself, we sort of deconstructed it and then reformatted it and resubmitted it to in a different form. And the purpose of the table 1 that's included in our report was to show you sort of side by side how the zoning districts that are in the study area or adjacent to it compare to one another, so that you can more easily see where there are similarities and where there are differences. Although our report speaks about all the different uses that are located in the GB district, I noticed when I was re-reviewing table 1 that we had inadvertently left out one of the land uses. So I actually have reprinted that table and I was going to give it to you today so that you have the more current version. I also enlarged it to 11 by 17 because I thought it was easier to see everything in fewer pages. I think the one there, not all passes on now.
So I will look at this in the book too.
The only change of substance appears on the second page of this table, and the land use that had inadvertently been skipped over. I've done it in a sort of tract format so you can see it's underlined, but it's about the middle of the page, just above the fold of the paper, and it says building materials, storage, and sales. The text of the report speaks of it, but it was just inadvertently skipped in the actual table itself. So on the leftmost side of this table, we've identified all the land uses that are currently permitted in the GB district. And the way in which the zoning law presents this information is sort of a cascading system of identifying land uses, so that it often will start out by referring back to other districts where it might say same as permitted in that other district or same as that other district. Sometimes it has the words as permitted therein, sometimes it doesn't. Where it says as permitted therein, it means that not only is the land use permitted, but all the procedural requirements that are associated with that land use in the other district also get carried forward. If it just identifies the land use and it doesn't indicate as permitted therein, then typically those supplementary procedural requirements are not relevant to the GB district. So what we did in this table was to identify sort of across the board the land uses that are allowed in the GB district, in the central business B district, that's the one that only exists in Banksville, and in the adjacent R1A and R2A districts. And the entire first page of this table shows that the general business, the GB district, allows all of the same uses as are currently permitted in the 1 acre and the 2 acre districts. The central business B district does not permit those particular uses. Then if you turn the page, you'll see as the table expands, there's a number of uses that are permitted in the GB district only that are not permitted in the 1 acre or 2 acre districts. But a few of them are permitted in the CBB district. And this is, again, by virtue of that sort of cascading presentation of information and the schedule of permitted uses. At the top of the list are 2 uses that are permitted in the shopping center, the SC district, which are also permitted in the GB district. And they obviously capture quite a number of different types of commercial uses. The stores for retail businesses, restaurants, cafeterias, bars, cabarets, personal service establishments. There is an exception for dry cleaning services that are not connected to a public sewer system, which would be the case here because there is no sewer in Banksville. And business and professional offices. In addition, carry-out restaurants are permitted. So that whole group of land uses gets captured by reference to the SC district. And then you finally move down to the rest of this table, which identifies the uses that are listed specifically in the GB district that are not really being borrowed from other districts, but that's really where they are intended to be established. And it lists a whole host of different uses that are permitted in the GB district. Now, a few of these uses are permitted in the CBB district. If you look sort of sideways into column 2, you'll see that there are 4 uses listed here that are permitted both in the GB district and in the CBB district. This table does not identify all the different non-residential districts in the town, but we did actually look at those in comparison to the GB district. And there are a few additional uses that are permitted in the GB district that are also permitted in the industrial district or the one of the other business districts. So there are a couple of instances in where some of the GB uses are permitted in a few other different districts. So on page 6 of our memo, there's a few.
Could I just one
Yes,
question?
sure.
If I'm reading it correctly, there's only one use in CBB that's not permitted in GB, and that's the fast food restaurant?
That's correct.
Okay.
There are a few numbers that we've referred to on page 6 of our memo, where we've identified how many different land uses are permitted in different districts. There's a couple of discrepancies that I want to correct, so when I resubmit the land use figure and a couple of other items that need to be updated, I will make those corrections as well. Rather than the GB district permitting a total of 29 separate uses as we've presented them here, it's actually 30. And there are a couple of other clarifications that we want to make. The second paragraph on that page.
What page you?
Page 6.
Oh.
The second paragraph, or the last paragraph, rather, of that page refers to 12 uses being permitted in the GB district, only 4 of which are listed as principal permitted uses. It's actually 13, and the 4 should be 7. They're listed in the table, they just were not called out completely in the text that corresponds to it. And then in addition to that, there's actually 6 uses that are not specifically listed as principal permitted uses in any other zoning district except for the GB district. And those are the ones that are listed at the bottom of page 6. It's a complete and accurate recitation of those uses. It's the arts and crafts occupation, the printing establishments with a gross floor area not exceeding 3,000 square feet, wholesale and storage uses except junkyards in completely enclosed buildings. The 4th one is automotive body shops in completely enclosed buildings. The 5th one is building materials, storage, and sales, and the 6th one is storage of contractors' equipment. We were also asked to provide a recap of the town plan recommendations and the way in which those recommendations were translated into proposed zoning amendments in 2005 and 2006. I've already given you a general recap at the beginning of this discussion on those, but I'll highlight a few items. I think one of the important observations that the town plan made was that from a policy perspective, it was recommended that the town's business districts be designed to only serve the local retail and service needs of the community. We felt that there are many other locations outside of the town of North Castle that were well equipped to serve more major shopping needs, and that those in North Castle did not need to serve that function. In terms of Banksville itself, it was computed that the Hamlet had a considerable amount of development potential, far in excess of that which would be needed by the projected population in that area. I think the number was about 173,000 square feet of surplus commercial development potential. Had all of the different...
That's purely projected.
It's a projection of development potential based on existing zoning in comparison to the projected population potential based upon residential development potential, and a comparison between the two, and some rule of thumb for how many square feet of commercial space one needs per person. Right. So a lot of projections. But they were all based upon the zoning that existed at that point in time and the amount of land that was not yet developed or underdeveloped. Had the town board proceeded with all the different zoning amendments that had been proposed in 2005, that development potential would have been significantly reduced. That 173,000 would have been cut back to about 168,000, so that it would have left a little bit of development potential, but not much more than what existed at that point in time. But those were among the zoning amendments that were generally not adopted. And some of those zoning amendments are not even part of the study area that we're looking at now. Many of them have to do with the west side of Bedford, Banksville Avenue instead. There were also recommendations in the town plan very specifically stating that the GB district is really not appropriate for Banksville and ought to be eliminated altogether. So the recommendations that were made in 2005 and 2006 were entirely consistent with the town plan policy recommendations at that point in time. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the town plan focused on environmental factors and the importance of giving more priority attention to them as part of land planning and various regulatory strategies that the town might be thinking about implementing. The recommendation for creation of the groundwater protection overlay district is rooted in the town plan policies. And then obviously the town board was diligent about trying to connect the dots and go from recommendation to implementation. And that's why that overlay district was proposed for discussion. The town plan has very specific recommendations for zoning changes in the Banksville Hamlet. It doesn't necessarily recommend a precise zoning district, but it recommends a land use classification. So the western end of Banksville Avenue, which would basically just capture the corner property, is recommended for commercial use, but the entire rest of the study area is recommended for low-density residential development. And at the time, the town board translated that into a 1-acre district, and that was the proposal that was under discussion in 2005 and 2006.
How can you do that?
Well, I'm only reciting what the report studied right now. The town board is going to examine what they want to do on a going forward basis. There are quite a number of general environmental policies that really were town-wide recommendations. They don't always pertain to Banksville. I won't spend too much time on that now. As you know, the GEIS was a two-step process. The town board first prepared a draft generic environmental impact statement on all the different rezonings that were proposed. They included map amendments as well as different text amendments. As it affects Banksville, and principally those 5 zoning map amendments that I mentioned earlier that were discussed, and they were analyzed, and they were quantified to the extent possible, so that if there were changes proposed from GB to residential, an attempt was made to quantify the impacts of that. And that translated into a projected increase of about 5 dwelling units and a reduction of 168,000 square feet of commercial potential. That was sort of the bottom line associated with those rezonings. When the town board held public hearings on the proposed zoning amendments in 2005, it then needed to prepare a final generic environmental impact statement that provided responses to the comments that had been received during the public hearing process. And the town board, it appears to me, listened very hard to all the comments that were submitted both in writing and at the public hearing, and made a number of significant changes to the proposed action that was planned at that time. As I discussed before, the town board decided to abandon 3 of the 5 zoning amendments that had been proposed for Banksville. It didn't say that they were going to never be re-examined. It just said at this time they decided not to proceed with them, and they felt that some of these issues would need to be referred to the planning board for further study. There were 3 potential rezonings that were still under discussion when the final generic impact statement was prepared. One was the corner property where Finch's is located. The other one is the property where the gas station had been located across from the firehouse. And the third was a property that was located directly behind or to the west of the tennis facility. 2 of those 3, the first 2 that I mentioned, we thought had both been adopted, but it was only the one related to the gas station that ultimately was passed as an adopted local law. And the town board did not proceed with the one on the other side of Bedford Banksville Avenue at all. But it was studied in the generic impact statement. There were a whole host of comments that the town board received during that public hearing process. We reread all the commentary that came out of that process, and we tried to highlight sort of the broad themes that were shared with the town board at the time, and presumably these are some of the reasons why the board felt that this would need more study. There were some people who felt that the types of businesses that existed on Banksville Avenue were actually important businesses, were serving a valuable function, and that the town actually needed those businesses, and it was an appropriate location for them to be. The observation was made that some of the employees of those businesses are exactly the same people who are available to serve as volunteer firemen in the nearby firehouse, and that those people are the ones who are available during the day, and it was important to keep them in the Banksville Hamlet. Other people felt that it was important to maintain a mixed-use character of that street. Obviously, some of these observations are completely contrary to what the town plan was saying at the time, but these were the opinions that were being shared with the town board when the public hearing was undergoing. Some people felt that if there were problems in the area, they would best be dealt with by more stringent enforcement of existing regulations rather than by changing the permitted land uses in the GB district. Another recommendation was made that the town investigate the feasibility of installing a public water supply or sewer system, which I believe has been studied in the past a few times and was thought to be cost prohibitive. I don't know whether that's something that could be visited, but that was something that was observed at the time. A number of people, I guess, shared the concern about protecting environmental resources and making sure that any new development was sensitive to those areas such as the aquifer, but we're not persuaded that a change to residential development instead of commercial is necessarily going to achieve those objectives. There was a feeling that perhaps those residential uses could pose just as much danger to those sensitive environmental resources as would what was permitted at that point in time. There was some discussion of what would happen if zoning were to be changed. What would that mean for the owners of property that became non-conforming? It would probably be exactly what would happen today if any change were to be proposed. There is a section of the town zoning law that talks about non-conforming uses, and assuming the town board doesn't do anything that's unusual, they would continue to exist, they could continue to function. They generally cannot be expanded, but they would basically become pre-existing non-conforming uses and would continue to remain. And then I guess the final comment was that even if the property was not necessarily being used for commercial purposes at the time of these public hearings, there were some owners of property or their representatives who felt that the people who own property along that street had certain expectations as to what it could be used for. It was sort of part of their own personal estate planning, so to speak, and they wanted some assurance that those rights, those property rights would continue and could be passed down to their descendants. Some of the properties were owned by the same family for multiple generations already at the time of these public hearings. So that's sort of a more broad overview of the past history, and now I think I want to spend the rest of this time just talking a little bit about some of the concepts that you might want to spend a little more time studying on a going forward basis. I think it's very clear that the implementation strategy that was discussed in 2005 and 2006 is the only one that is entirely consistent with the 1996 town plan recommendations. There's a total linkage across the board from policy to proposed implementation. So any really significant deviation from the 1996 recommendations might suggest that it's important to re-examine the policies of the town plan to make sure that they're still valid. If they are still valid, then that would suggest a certain series of next actions. If you believe that some of those may need to be re-examined and possibly tweaked a little bit, that might allow for some other implementation strategies to be considered. But I think that's really a starting point for going forward. In order to identify some possible strategies, we have to make an assumption that the board felt that the policies were still valid. Obviously, if you come to a different conclusion, then that will send you in a different direction. But for the purposes of this report, we need to make that assumption. and then other ideas could flow from that assumption. There's a couple of zoning amendments that we think are reasonable to consider, and we don't think they're going to be terribly involved, although there's no guarantees. The property that's under development now for a single-family home, it would seem to be inappropriate to keep that in the GB district. It would make more sense to put that in the residential district that exists on the opposite side of the street. So initially, that would be our first recommendation, that we put it into the 1 acre district. On the land use map, that's the one that has the note that says single-family residence under construction on figure 2. There's a property immediately to the south of that, which is on.
So just,
Yes,
you're saying
sure.
to remove that use from GB, is that what you said?
Yes, yes. That would be our initial recommendation, that it be put into the 1 acre district, which is it almost is directly opposite the 1 acre district. There's a little bit of 2 acre in the corner, but generally it's across the street from a 1 acre district. We thought it would be important for both sides of Roundhouse Road to be in the same zoning district. And initially, we felt that that recommendation was a relatively straightforward one. The property at the corner of Banksville Avenue and Roundhouse Road is in residential use at the moment. There do appear to be 2 buildings on the same lot, which normally would not be permitted, but it is a residential use, and we felt that it was also appropriate for that property to be considered a residential property from a zoning perspective. Initially, we suggested it could also be put into the 1 acre district, but I think that may depend on how the rest of Banksville Avenue is treated. It is possible a half acre district could also be considered. So those are the first 2 relatively straightforward suggestions that we had presented in this report. Beyond that, we have a number of different options. Nothing is as clear cut once you get past those 2 lots, except for the western end. I think the proposal to put the corner property at the western end in the CBD district made sense in 2005, and it still makes sense. It's one of the only properties on that street that's not in the same zoning district. It would fit into the CBD district without any difficulty. And it seems to make sense for that property to be in that district. But obviously, that's just sort of nibbling away at the edges, the western and the eastern end. And the heart of this, right, the heart of this challenge really lies in the central portion of Banksville Avenue.
The CBB, you just mentioned that was the corner one?
Yes, where Finch's is located.
And can you just confirm for me, a pre-existing non-conforming use would not, the use would not change the title, it would change the use? So
Yes.
if somebody sold it to
Yes.
somebody else,
The use would
the use
continue.
continues.
Yes.
If somebody changed the use, it breaks the chain, and then you're.
If somebody abandons the use for a period of time, which is defined in the code, they may lose that right to be grandfathered. But as long as the use continues and is not changed, it's protected.
What is our code required? A year? It's a year.
There are some provisions that deal with damage by fire, and there are percentages that are listed in the code depending on how much damage occurs. That could also affect the status on a going forward basis. The North Castle Code actually has, I think, a more generous provision in that regard than some others I've seen. It has different tiers, from like 25%, 50%, 75%, with different outcomes depending on where one falls in that spectrum. But those are basically the ground rules that would affect non-conforming uses. There's an opportunity, I'm not suggesting that you do this, but when new legislation is enacted, if the real goal is to get rid of those non-conforming uses, sometimes some kind of an amortization period is written into the legislation that basically allows them to continue for a period of time, but at a certain point they have to sort of cease and desist. I'm not suggesting you do that, and there's nothing in the code that speaks to that point now, but that's an option. But that would be the more extreme way of treating those kinds of non-conforming uses. Okay, with regard to the central portion of the study area, we identified a number of different possibilities. We did not reach any conclusion. I think this needs more discussion, but we've laid out some options that the board might want to think about. Obviously, one option is to do nothing, just leave the GB district exactly where it is. That would retain the conflict between the town plan recommendation and the reality, but that is an option that could be considered. Another possibility is to more closely examine the provisions of the GB district. not to change the zoning necessarily, but to look at the land uses that are permitted in the district. And that's where we're hoping that table 1 will come in handy, because we've really very clearly laid out all those different land uses so that you can dissect them in more detail. There are a few land uses in there that we know have been considered troublesome, and to a large extent, I think the continued authorization to have those land uses in that area may continue to be a problem from a land use perspective and possibly in an environmental perspective. But that particular option would involve amending the GB district to remove certain land uses that are now permitted, so they would no longer be permitted in the GB district. The ones that had been identified during our earlier discussions included automotive body shops, the gasoline filling and service stations, and the storage of contractor equipment, or what's known, I guess, here as building supply yards, etc. There may be some others. You may be actually surprised to see how many different uses are permitted in the GB district, because it's actually almost a catch-all district. It's the only district, the GB districts in Banksville are the only ones that exist in the town. And the town plan clearly envisioned that they would be eliminated and replaced with other districts. If the board feels that the area on the north side of Banksville Avenue ought to be treated differently than the other GB districts that are in Banksville, but still wants to keep a GB type of district, then it may be necessary to create 2 versions of a GB district. One that would still exist on the west side of Banksville Avenue, and one that would exist on the north side of Banksville Avenue. So there are a number of different variations on this theme, and it all depends on probably the outcome of additional discussion as to what you believe is the appropriate land use for that area. These recommendations are really, I guess, driven by both land use concepts as well as environmental protection objectives, and I think both of those probably should be given equal weight. As I mentioned earlier, there are some different mapping sources that identify the location of the aquifer as well as the critical environmental area. There's some slight variation in the boundaries, but all of them do stress the importance of making sure that the land uses that are permitted will not contribute to the contamination of those underground water supplies. If the town board thinks that it's appropriate to continue eliminating the GB district, then obviously something else has to go in its place. And there's a couple of options that could be considered. And I'm not suggesting that these are consistent with the town plan in all cases, but depending on which direction the board feels it's appropriate, it may also be necessary to amend the town plan again. One would be to examine the CBB district provisions and potentially wrap them around the corners so that we continue on the north side of Banksville Avenue, rather. So not only with the property at the corner at which is located be put into that district, but so too with some of the other properties going in the easterly direction from there. I think the CBB district offers a number of different options, but perhaps ought to be broadened in some respects. There was another report done in 1986 on Banksville, which was the last of a series of reports that the Conservation Board had done, and a number of recommendations were made in that report for re-examining the provisions of the CBD district and perhaps allowing certain uses that are not mentioned, such as churches, libraries, government facilities, and in addition, tweaking some uses that were already permitted and in some cases requiring special permit approval where they had just been considered uses permitted by site plan approval prior to that point in time. So, unrelated to this particular use study that we're doing, there are also recommendations that had not been implemented going back to 1986 in that regard. And if the board were to entertain that type of rezoning concept, it would be a good opportunity to also kind of fold some of those other recommendations into it. We had also called attention to 2 uses that are permitted in CBD now, which we found a little bit puzzling. One was the fast food restaurant. CBD seems to be the least intensive of all the commercial districts in the town, and we just couldn't understand why fast food restaurants were permitted in that district. So we thought that was one that you might want to eliminate. And then in addition, there is some opportunity for housing in the CBD district, but it has certain restrictions on it. And in fact, the provision is not even easy to find. It's buried in the accessory use column of the schedule of permitted uses. And it's not really listed as a principal permitted use, it's just something in combination with a commercial use. And I know that there's been interest expressed over a period of years and is continuing the concept of introducing more mixed-use development into these types of Hamlet business districts. I know that the design guidelines that you've been reviewing in draft form contain a similar recommendation, but aside from those, that's a common theme that many communities are finding an attractive way to sort of enliven these little hamlet areas. So you might want to examine that aspect of the CBB district and perhaps be a little more proactive about that and more direct about how you
Just include more residential in CBD.
Right, right. So these are some of the ways in which the CBD district could be perhaps adjusted. Whether or not you decide to wrap it around Banksville Avenue or not, you still might want to look at some of those policies as they affect the rest of Bedford-Banksville Road.
But that doesn't show here, does it?
The
There's
housing,
no reference to
not on the.
residential and CBD.
No, because it wasn't listed as a permitted principal use. We found it in the accessory use column. Now, we could, if you like, I mean, we more or less have concluded the study, but if you want to ask us to do some additional work, we could probably add accessory uses to this table as well. Most of them are relatively innocuous. That was probably the most substantive of all the accessory uses that we found buried, not where we were expecting it, but we've addressed it in the narrative of the report,
Okay.
but it's not in this table 1. Okay, another possibility is one that has more of a residential flavor, which would make it more consistent with the town plan recommendations from the 1996 plan update. And that would be, instead of pursuing the 1 acre zoning that had been recommended initially, it would be instead to think about half-acre zoning. That would still be consistent with the town plan recommendation, because both the half-acre and the 1 acre districts are considered low intensity or low density residential. So you would still not be creating a conflict between the implementation and the town plan policy. The other reason why that might be a reasonable approach is because the zoning on the south side of Banksville Avenue in the town of Greenwich is R20, which is very similar to the half-acre district in terms of development potential. In the footnote of table 1, which is exactly, in the new table, it's exactly as it was in the one we submitted earlier, we described the zoning that's permitted in the town of Greenwich and tried to give you some flavor to the types of land uses that Greenwich permits. Not that you're obviously bound by that in any way, but the character of that street is defined by what's happening on both sides of the street, not just in North Castle. So we've tried to explain what's actually permitted in Greenwich at the present time. So that would be another option. Some of the issues that were raised in 2005 with regard to elimination of commercial development potential would still be presumably repeated, but that would be another possible strategy. Then sort of going in a somewhat different direction, we also felt that if the town felt that it had very good, reliable data on the location of the aquifer and wanted to devise a zoning policy that was rooted more in that environmental feature, that it was possible some distinctions could be made between the western half of Banksville Avenue and the eastern half. That's not quite as clear cut, but if the town board believes that the most preeminent theme that should be followed is the environmental protection objective and wants to give higher priority to that than to the basic land use policy recommendations, then it would probably be important to focus on that a little bit more. And it may result in a decision to zone the western half of Banksville Avenue differently than the eastern half. In addition, either in combination with some of these zoning strategies or in lieu of them, if the town board were to decide to revisit the concept of the groundwater protection overlay district, it might also be possible to achieve some of the policy objectives of the town plan without necessarily changing the zoning. There's quite a lot of information in the record explaining what the concerns were about that groundwater protection overlay district. So I think it would be possible to revisit that and try to address some of those concerns head on and still potentially go forward with some alternative version of a groundwater protection overlay district. That possibly might allow the town to ensure that anything that is proposed on that street or in the area of sensitivity at least is not going to create the problems that were foreseen. So that might be something that the board could re-examine, although that goes beyond just the zoning study, that's a different tack, so to speak. And I guess we've also made the assumption that the public water and sewer option is not likely to be viable. Clearly, if it's something that can be examined or pursued, that opens up other opportunities for different types of policies to be considered for this area. But it's basically land use themes, and then there's environmental protection themes. And I think the town plan tried to balance both of those, and 2005 recommendations followed suit. There may be some opportunities to do something a little bit different, but I guess it would be important for the board to sort of go back and look at those policies and decide whether or not they were valid and still are, or whether they should be modified as sort of a starting point. So that's my overview.
Thank you, that's very comprehensive. Questions?
Yes,
The only one I would maybe add as is, I'd like to see what those accessory, whatever you call them,
Accessory uses.
accessory uses are. Just it'd be good to have that in a file, and if you had it,
Yeah, it's in the town.
it'd be good just maybe to have a exhibit A on here so we could look at that.
Do you have any history, and Roland also might be a good person for this question, on previous GB districts in the town that were converted, and how they were converted into what? Do you have any history
As
on
far as
that?
I know, the GB's always been in Banksville.
That's it?
Yeah, at least in recent history.
I mean, going back in time,
I don't recall, but we can try to find out.
because they were more common, and they're
Over time, you say
slowly
they've
over
been
time in the
eliminated.
county being eliminated, they're rare to find in the county.
I think
So
at the
I
time,
think it's unique. I don't think different municipalities regulate, there isn't necessarily an equivalent GB district in another municipality. Now, this is something, there might be similar districts, but
you're saying if you go back far enough, North Castle may have had other GB districts other than what's in
I'm just
Banksville.
curious what happened, if there was any history, on what happened when we converted other GB districts into what?
I could look into
I don't think
it.
they
It's
were.
certainly many, many, many decades ago.
Yeah, there's no mention of it, I don't recall, in the 1996 town plan in terms of sort of historical evolution. So it might be a couple of plans prior to that when it might have been discussed.
I have a question, Brian. Starting in 1986, this area has been studied, and studied again in the master plan, comprehensive plan, and of course, the land use study committee did extensive studies. Has anything changed in all that time as far as,
In terms of land use.
well, just the environmental criteria of that area and the land use of that area? I mean, nothing is really.
Well, I guess,
That's what I'm getting at, is everything that has been studied, the points or the factors that were discovered during each one of those studies is almost 100% the same
I'd say that's generally
over
true.
30 years.
Yeah, I'd say that's generally true. I mean, I think
Nothing
the
has
new
changed.
feature is the designation of the CEA, which came about in 1990. So that was pre-town plan of 96, but it's been within that 30-year time interval you referred to. That would be sort of a new level of scrutiny that was applied to the resource.
The aquifer overlays that you're
Well,
referring
the aquifer, I guess, had been identified for a while, but the critical environmental area designation, which is a county designation, that's a new type of,
So the only thing
Not
that's
post,
changed.
not post the comprehensive.
no, that was before the comprehensive plan.
Okay, okay.
Right, so it's already reflected in that.
So the level of scrutiny on environmentally on this property has increased. That's really the only difference
That's the principle.
over 30 years. I mean, Adam, I know I was on the land use study committee with you, and we spent 18 months and probably a couple of days a week. I can't even imagine the amount of hours and money spent on this, and nothing has really changed since then. Am I correct?
Correct, yeah.
One thing of clarification, from talking with Adam, I think I understand this, but I want to be sure. If, for example, any of these other pieces of property were to be zoned R1A, for example, consistent with what's on the east side of Roundhouse Road, none of these lots are the size of an acre. They're all smaller. But my understanding is they would still be grandfathered into a condition where a house can be built even though they have less land than an acre.
I believe there's some special provision that explains how those adjustments would be made.
Yeah, because otherwise you make the land unusable for anything.
Right, no, I think there's a provision in most codes, I think North Essex has the same kind of provision that deals with that circumstance.
And similarly, again for clarification, you take a vacant parcel, if it's rezoned to residential, that eliminates the only thing you can do with a vacant parcel is now conform with the new code. However, if you've got a use that exists, that can go on forever without conforming to the new zone.
That's typically the case, yes. Now, I just want to point out that even though 1A sounds fairly restrictive, then it probably would be viewed that way in comparison to GB. If you look at Table 1, that entire first page identifies all the different uses that are permitted in 1 acre, which is still a very long list of uses. Not that everyone would immediately
There are
try
other
to propose
uses
this.
besides.
I think there are 17 uses permitted in the 1 acre district. Obviously, the most common one is a single family home, but there are many other uses that are actually permitted. Some of them might even surprise you because I don't think you normally associate some of these uses in the 1 acre district.
Like membership.
I was just gonna say that. Or a nursing home.
Highlight
Nursing home.
Public telephone booth.
Yeah, those are pretty funny too. That's interesting. Someone will say, what's that? I never heard of such a thing.
Do you have a list of permitted uses for the, what is it, R1/2A?
They're the same.
They're actually the same.
They're
It's just
exactly
they're
They're
not
permitted in the 1 acre district, it's also permitted in half acre district and the 2
I
acre
think it goes,
district.
it captures maybe 3 or 4 different districts that are all these exact same uses.
For future discussion purposes, can we get a single document that marries this information and the aquifer and wetlands and water courses all in the same thing?
So you want to put environmental
Well,
features
because I
on there?
think you need to look at it
Well,
from
part
a
of
planning standpoint. As you say, you spoke very well. There's zoning issues and there's environmental issues, but they have to go in concert, and all that information isn't in one place that
Yes,
I
I know, I realize that. I guess part of the reason we're hesitant in mapping it now is because we've checked 3 different maps and they don't all show the exact same boundary. I didn't want to just arbitrarily pick one of those and put that on here. because that
Specifically
might
to the
miss-
CEA?
Yes,
Yeah,
well,
well-
not so much the CEA, but the aquifer location. So I thought that was going to need more discussion before we actually committed into a graphics presentation. I was worried about just creating some misimpressions about where it was.
So where does that information reside? With you or with?
Well, the aquifer has to be mapped by an expert who can delineate the boundaries of the aquifer. Certainly, I don't have that skill.
So that's not one of your little buttons you put on your program?
No.
Somebody
The
has done that.
location-
Well, it was done multiple times. I mean, there was, when the town plan was prepared, some analysis was done of these aquifer locations based upon stratified drift the sand aquifers and all the different properties that existed. And some sort of conceptual map was prepared, and that's in the town plan. And then when the moratorium was in effect and the planning and zoning study was underway, I believe it was Keller Engineering looked at it again and consulted various sources and then prepared an updated map, which became part of the GEIS. And then, in addition to that, there's the CEA maps that are prepared by Westchester County, and they show a slightly different map. Although the town plan and the county CEA maps are closest to each other. It's the one in the middle that was part of the GEIS process that seems to show a slightly smaller area being affected
That's
by
the
that.
Keller one.
Yes, that's the one in the middle.
You're saying
And
the
that was
CEA
also,
So if the CEA area is larger,
yes,
why not? I don't think.
that's the
any-
most conservative,
Right,
and
and
that's an
no.
officially designated
Exactly.
map.
Right.
So
That's-
we can certainly put the CEA boundary on the map.
I think that's.
Now, the
I
only-
don't know
we
how
could also
much money I
put-
would be spending, but I don't see making final decisions without that
No, I
document,
think it's
providing that
important.
information. I don't know how you get it or who is authorized to do it, but I think that ought to be on the list.
Well, putting on the CEA is very easy. that we can put on NWI wetlands and New York State wetlands. However, that's not going to capture the full picture. I know for a fact that there are locally regulated wetlands that aren't captured under the NWI by the state.
Yeah, you
So
want
you're
the
not
Neannis River tributaries in here that we know, I mean, you see them in our area, but you would like to have it
And we don't
called
have,
out.
right, and we don't have that data in the GIS for those locally regulated wetlands that we know exist.
So someone like Keller's got to put it on there? How do you
We
get
could
there?
do it by hand,
That would be sufficient. Again, I think,
but we need to know where they are. Right, so that means we would have to have access to these properties and then have the soil scientists designate where those wetlands are. So the way our code reads now, if you bring an application in, you're required to do that investigation, and then we'll know for that specific project where the wetlands are. We don't have it globally for the whole hamlet.
There is a map, I believe, in the town plan, though, that describes soil conditions, and it does describe hydro soil.
I think that would be sufficient.
Which
You don't
largely
need to
will
go survey
correspond
every-
to some of those
you
wetland
know, all the
areas.
dirt here. That's what I'm looking for.
And just so we can see where
Yeah,
that
exactly.
lines are.
Now, we can by hand identify the Neannis River tributaries because you can see them.
No, that's an excellent summary of where we were, how we got here, and what decisions the town board has to make in terms of the future of Banksville Avenue. At this point, you know, if the town board has some initial thoughts on a direction that they feel is appropriate, you can start the discussion there.
Well, I think Bob's correct, we need to get the best science we can get, and then at that point, make some decisions. But I think after 30 years, we need to make a decision. Thank you, Joanne. Thanks for seeing me, guys.
If you look at these, they're comparable, right? And you just go,
Yeah, there's a single, see with the SFR, there's a single-family residence there. Right next to a contractor yard, right next to a vacant building, right next to two residences, right? And this is under construction, and here's the
two buildings.
two buildings, yeah. These are all going to be redone, because you see the lot line does not go to the top of the frame. It has to be moved down. So she's taking this with her, and it's going to redo it actively.
Want that straight?
And I take this one now? Oh,
Yeah.
you're photographing it?